Hello, everybody. I'm George from Ireland. Well, thanks for watching this channel. Thank you for coming back. And this is about the Russo-Ukrainian War. And my goodness, we're day 1,000 and who knows how many. I was reflecting the other day that this is coming up to be as long as the Second World War was for the Soviet Union. Because remember, that was 22nd of June to 15th of August, 22nd of June 1941, 15th of August 1945, unless you count the German surrender, 8th of May, as we say in Western Europe, 9th of May, as they say. So, around 4 years. And this has been going for 3.5 years. It's easily going to go for another 6 months. I mean, it could go for another 6 years. Unless, of course, you count the war starting in 2014 rather than 2022. But even if we go with that 24th of February 2022 starting date, yeah, it will soon be as long as the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets call it. To think that the Soviet Union, and I know the Russian Federation is not the Soviet Union, defeated a superpower at the time. Admittedly, they had a lot of allies, being driven all the way back to Moscow or down to Stalingrad and got all the way to Berlin by the end. You see how little ground the Russians have gained in that time. Okay, so he's not exactly Stalin. I know he'd like to be as evil as Stalin, but he's not as effective as Stalin, Putin. So what's the situation now? So their summer offensive began on May Day. They made small gains, something like 15 square kilometers per day. So something like 500 square kilometers in May, speeding up to about 470 kilometers in June, and so on. And it's sped up again in July. Maybe looks like it's going to speed up again in August. Obviously, too early to say. So advancing in various areas around Toretsk, Pokrovsk, Konstantinivka, and there I was months ago thinking Pokrovsk was about to fall, and they've managed to hold on. So Ukraine's got better building defenses, minefields, trenches, their kill zones with the drones are going to be there, and they've been counterattacking locally and so on. Because the Ukrainians, well, they went into defense because they were going to take their country back in 2022, and obviously then their summer, they did well that September 2022 counteroffensive, which nobody saw coming, same time as the death of the Queen, which is why it wasn't front page news around the world, should have been. Summer offensive 2023 failed because they attacked exactly the Russians had expected, and they prepared very strong defenses. So they only got about a tenth of the distance they needed to get to the Sea of Azov and break the land corridor. So then obviously they had another surprise counteroffensive last summer into Kursk Oblast, into Russian sovereign territory. And apparently the Russians have quite pushed them out. There's a tiny sliver of Russia they still hold. Well, what a humiliation of Russia to lose territory for the first time in 80 years. And they weren't losing it to a mighty country like Germany. They're losing it to Ukraine, which they outnumber almost 4-1. But the Russians, even they have learned a little bit, some adaptability. They become flexible. Some local commanders getting motorbikes, anything for their troops to cross sort of the no man's land to get to the Ukrainian trenches, because the point is to get across that as fast as possible, because that's when they're out exposed. Um, so yeah, earlier this year they were attacking on several different fronts, and they brought in more troops. Often they've been rushed through basic training to try and keep up the pressure. And they were quite optimistic. The Ruskies, Trump had come in, they thought was their man, and he cut off military aid. He said no intelligence sharing, or that's that spat. And one thing is to make some big gains before there was going to be a ceasefire. And obviously, Putin played Trump thrice. They thought there could be a ceasefire. Thrice, Putin started adding conditions at the last minute. It still hasn't happened, and even these latest threats from the United States have not evinced a reaction. So, Trump is even stupider than I thought. But perhaps even he has finally perceived that he's been made to look a fool, and is finally going to impose some serious sanctions. The 50-day limit, there's going to be 10 or 12-day limit. But you never know where you are with Trump. He's so erratic, a weather vane mind. He's so fundamentally dim that he could impose sanctions and lift them the next day. So he's predictably unpredictable. But there it goes on. All right. So this is the attritional war, the Russians think, well, they'll run out of people for long before we will, because our population's so much bigger. We're much more successful at recruiting people abroad, even if hoodwinking them, telling they're here on a construction job, and then press ganging them into the Russian military, meat attacks, particularly sending foreigners in as just a diversionary move. And these decoys, they'll just get killed, and they'll identify the enemy positions before the real thrust goes in by the properly trained and equipped troops. Um, but yeah, so Russia's losses are very heavy. 900,000 killed. Oh, so sorry, 900,000 casualties is the lowest estimate by reputable sources, with about 190,000 killed. The highest estimate is about 1.3 million casualties, of which up to 350,000 killed. I mean, I think that's a considerable overestimate. So easily 1,000 casualties a day, only about a quarter of whom are killed. So they made progress, yeah, because they've adapted their tactics. They've got more drones. They're manufacturing all the Shahed drones. Major attacks on Ukrainian cities, hundreds of drones, several nights in a row. The one thing is that militarily, that doesn't really help. They don't use them at military targets. It's just to terrorize the civilian population. And Ukraine doesn't have an answer to that. The Patriot system's okay, but Patriots, these missiles are expensive. You want them to shoot down big things. The obvious thing is to destroy whoever is making the drones or firing the drones, and they're still not being given permission to fire deep into Russia. So goodness. Um, yeah, what was I going to say? So, yeah, Russia has advanced relentlessly. It's sped up a little bit, although you would expect this because this is prime campaigning season. Now, it's probably going to slow down end of October. It gets colder, it gets muddier, and so on. It's more difficult to move. Even vehicles, and yes, they're off-road vehicles like tanks can go through anything, but they're not that many of them. They've lost so many tanks. So even if they broke through the Ukrainian lines, they wouldn't really be able to exploit it because they don't have enough tanks, particularly modern ones. They've often taken these things out of storage, I mean, this is the 60s, not been maintained, hardly in working condition, and they're very prone to mechanical breakdowns. So they're not going, can't go very far or go very fast. So they do manage to break through. What's the chance the Russians will get to Kiev by the end of this year? I mean, I think low, like 20%. I mean, a lot of other people would say even lower than that. Um, but they're definitely making progress. So the idea is that they will just fatigue the Ukrainians so much, the Ukrainian morale will certainly finally collapse. There'll be mass desertions and so on. Obviously, going absent without leave is a major problem in the Ukrainian military. But so long as a guy returns to his unit voluntarily, no action is taken. The Ukrainians, they still only conscript people at the age of 25. They can volunteer from 18. The obvious solution is to bring that down to 18. Even conscript women, even if not in combat roles, because that might not be politically acceptable. Have them as, I don't know, dispatch riders, cooks, anything, some sort of military role. That you can't just be a teacher, a hairdresser, however useful that is, or a hotel receptionist. No, you're going to have to work in a drone factory, or you're going to have to drive a truck of military supplies or something like that, something for the war effort. And just recruiting people from the developing world for whom some salaries might be kind of attractive. Okay, so why else is it going a bit better for Russia? Yeah, the strain is really telling on Ukraine, and yeah, so the war weariness and the obviously realization they can't really retake all this land. So there've been small counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, and locally they sometimes regain territory, but there isn't a grand counteroffensive. They're not, it seems like, trying to do that. So yeah, 15 square kilometers a day. That's not dramatic by Russia, but could suddenly speed up. So where they're really concentrating, the Ruskies, are Sumy and Donetsk. So coming a bit closer to Kharkiv, which is the second city, which is very close to the Russian border. So yeah, the glide bombs and missiles on Kiev to terrorize the civilian population, even there's not really a military rationale for doing this. So they're using the low quality troops. They're largely emptied the prison of anyone who would be usable. Obviously, a lot of young men have fled abroad, and there are only so many people that they can consider runts they can just throw at this. Putin said he wouldn't use school leavers, but he has. It's proven that people who've left school weeks before have been killed fighting in East Ukraine and Southern Ukraine. So yeah, there'll be the law of diminishing returns. 2010-06, the war may well slow down for Russia. They can think they can sustain it all through 2026, but that's when it really does become difficult, partly economically. The national wealth fund will be exhausted at some point. Somewhat depends on the oil prices. The oil prices could go up, in which case that makes things financially more viable for Russia. But if these sanctions kick in, that'll make it even worse. They're already cutting budgets in other areas like healthcare and education. They're already raising taxes. You know, their interest rate is very high, in like 20%. Their inflation is they admit 10%, probably higher than that. Um, there are other economic problems, as in the racist campaign against guest workers from Central Asia, like Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. So fewer people are coming, and there's a severe paucity of workers in agriculture and construction, in industry, and so on. So they're going to have to, change policy on that one. But people from Central Asia will be reluctant to come back. Notorious in the case of Azerbaijani citizens who were murdered by the police in police custody. And remember, Russia's got a fairly good relationship with Azerbaijan, considers it a somewhat important country. Even Azerbaijanis were brutally murdered doing nothing wrong. So people will be loath to come back. Those Central Asian workers would rather go to the Middle East for a higher wage, even Kazakhstan for a lower wage where they don't face such racism. Cost of living is lower. China, really just anywhere they can. So Russia will have problems in that. If you're conscripting people, but we don't have enough people to do all sorts of other jobs. Getting more troops from North Korea, that might not be a limitless reservoir of manpower. The Ukrainians, they've got some excellent drones and so on, but obviously that relies on military, political, financial support from other countries. So yeah, these are the reasons why Russia has managed to speed up. So in July, over 6,000 drone attacks on Kiev, 14-fold increase over July 2024. So all these deadly strikes in Kiev, because partly they were saving for the winter. Now I do shudder for the Ukrainians in the winter, because often the reason he's held off in the summer, say, is the winter will really target their energy infrastructure to freeze them to death in winter. Now, last winter they didn't really bother because it failed 2 winters in a row. So the third winter it was relatively easy for that, but there's this fourth one they might say, well, we've got loads of drones now, we really can take out for energy infrastructure. The only thing is, Ukraine is increasingly connected to the European Union economic grid, electric grid, so that might not really work. But anyway, so yeah, Russia is definitely making headway. Nobody doubts about that. But it's not impressive, and they were making almost no headway at the beginning of this year. So they might want to take the whole of Donetsk Oblast, which they probably will by the end of this year. What a psychological victory, but at what a cost, but deeply unimpressive. I mean, no Western army would be willing to tolerate such high losses for such a minimal gain. Can they really afford to go on paying this sort of price for this sort of gain? I can't remember who asked that about the First World War, but obviously Putin doesn't value human life, even of his own people. But yeah, so 2026, I think Russia can prosecute the war all through that year, but might be at a slower tempo. 2027, and that's where they really might be exhausted. Not that they'd have to give up territory, but freeze the conflict. A sort of agree to disagree, de facto Russian control, something like that. Right. Thank you for watching my channel. Make sure you subscribe on Patreon and PayPal, georgecalan79@gmail.com. Goodbye.